Well, good evening. The mic is working, so that's good. Yeah. So if you weren't here last week, my name is Carl, and I'm here, I guess this is the second of 4 Wednesday nights. We're exploring Anglican/Episcopalian spirituality from a variety of perspectives. And last week we kicked off with two medieval voices, the mystic known as Julian of Norwich, and then the other one, we don't know the author, but the book is called The Cloud of Unknown. And we wrapped up our evening with a little bit of silence inspired by The Cloud of Unknowing. We'll have some more time for some silence this evening, but I do want to introduce tonight's two figures before we get into that. So let's begin with just a moment for some prayer. Just once again acknowledging the wonderful promise from Jesus that where 2 or 3 or more are gathered, He is truly present. And the way I interpret that, my kind of layperson's exegesis, is that it means we encounter Jesus in our hearts and in the hearts of one another. So just acknowledging all the hearts that are here with us tonight, the hearts that are joining us through the magic of Zoom. Maybe holding a special place in our heart for anyone who's suffering tonight, particularly in Ukraine. Jesus, we thank you for accompanying us on our Lenten pilgrimage. We thank you for the opportunity to gather together to reflect on some voices from the past, some people who have followed you. May their words of wisdom and inspiration bring light and promise into our lives. The joyful confidence we pray. Amen. I said voices from the past, but actually one of the voices we're going to look at tonight, in fact, I think it's the only person in our series, is still alive. So I guess from the past, to the extent that I'm going to be quoting a talk that he gave about 10 years ago. So in that sense, it's the past. Rowan Williams is very much still alive, at least last I heard. So last week we talked about two mystics. Now, I know the word mystic is kind of a big and scary word, but the simple way of defining it is somebody who has had a meaningful, come on in, plenty of room, somebody who has had a meaningful experience of the presence of God in their lives. And especially the mystics who have left us books. Okay, I hope that wasn't me, but the mystics who have left us books or other writings, they have had these meaningful experiences and then they have shared that with others. But what I want to do tonight is talk about another category of spiritual teachers, and this category is the category of teachers. And to get us into that, I was thinking about what metaphor do I want to use. I'm going to say 2 words, and I bet pretty much everybody here will get the context. Here's Johnny. Most of us, I guess if you're under 35 or so, you may not quite get that. But for those of us who've been around the sun a few times, we know the story. Where would Johnny Carson be without Ed McColman? How many years did Ed McColman say that, night after night after night? It was kind of like the dinner bell. You ring the bell and the dog starts salivating. You say, "Here's Johnny," and you know the tonight's show has begun. And to bring that back to faith, we worship Jesus, but so much of our understanding of what it means to be a follower of Jesus is built on the words of St. Paul. In fact, somebody, I can't remember who it was, but somebody, 10 or 20 years ago, well, probably longer than that now, 30 years ago, wrote a book on the 1,000 most influential figures in Western history, or maybe in world history. I think it was world history. And so, of course, being a Christian, Jesus would be number one, right? But Jesus was number two. And number one went to Muhammad, and I was just like, oh, I think of myself as very interfaith friendly. I have a number of Muslim friends. I said, wait a minute, my guy's number one. Well, number three was Paul. And the author said, anticipated, he said, I'm sure many readers will be unhappy at how I have chosen the top three. But he said, I think it's important to acknowledge that Muhammad did it all himself. Jesus, however, his message was so important how it was amplified by the life and mission of St. Paul. So I said, if I had edited that book, I think Muhammad would have probably been number three. But hey, that's me. I'm sure most of my Muslim friends were probably happy with it. But back to the point tonight, is that I think you have the people who do the amazing things, but sometimes you have the people who take that and then bring it to a wider audience. And I think that, my wife worked for, I don't know how many years, 30 years or so for the Cobb County school system. I've never had an official teaching job, but I've done a lot of training over the years. Teaching, maybe our culture doesn't honor teachers enough. So part of what I want to do tonight is just celebrate the importance of the teacher in the spiritual life. And so the two figures that we're going to look at tonight, that they had other roles, but I really want to look at them because they are teachers. And the first one was a woman who lived in the UK. Well, in fact, tonight both of our figures are British. The next 2 weeks we'll have an American each night, one American and one Britain. But tonight we still have two folks from Britain. The woman's name is Evelyn Underhill. She lived from 1875 to 1941. She was a writer on spirituality. She was a retreat leader. In fact, in many ways, I'll be honest with you, my career, I have very consciously kind of emulated Evelyn Underhill. As a lay person, like myself, kind of her bread and butter was writing, was teaching, and was leading retreats. The feather in her cap that I cannot compete with, she was the first woman to lecture on religion at Oxford University. It's a significant achievement. She was a guest lecturer. It wasn't not even for a full semester, but she still has that distinction. I think it was the Archbishop of Canterbury, Michael Ramsey, who said she did more than anybody else in the Church of England to promote the cause of spirituality between the two world wars. She was active, well, even before World War I. Her most famous book was published in 1911. She dies in 1941. So about that 30-year period was when she was really active, 11 to 41. But then the other person that I want to focus on tonight is the previous Archbishop of Canterbury, the 104th Archbishop of Canterbury. His name was Rowan Williams. As I mentioned before, he is still with us, probably in his early 70s now. I think he was born in 1950. And he was the 104th Archbishop of Canterbury, so that in itself is significant. But that came after a fairly lengthy and fairly distinguished career as a college professor. Studied at Cambridge, got his PhD at Oxford. Not sure, he taught several different places. He's Welsh. And in fact, fun fact, he was the first Archbishop of Canterbury since the Reformation not to come from the Church of England, because he came from the Church of Wales. So, right next door, of course. But Archbishop of Canterbury from, I think, 2003 to 2013. I should be looking at my notes because it's all in there. But and then even after he stepped down, he retired as the Archbishop of Canterbury. Justin Welby, of course, the incumbent Archbishop of Canterbury, succeeded Rowan Williams. And he became the Chancellor of Monmouth College in Wales and did that until he turned 70 just a year or two ago. Now I think he's fully retired, although he's still publishing, so he's still obviously a writer. So both Underhill and Williams wrote many, many books. I'm going to, most of the material I'm going to give you today. Ooh, got some feedback on.
Sorry, I have someone back here.
That's all right. But I do have one, what I think is really wonderful quotation from Rowan Williams that I hope we will all do some shared reflection on before the evening is out. So if you don't have the handout, please grab it. Especially the quote from Rowan Williams will be looking at what's on there. Let me see what I can share with you. I'll kind of So, since our theme is prayer, I wanted to focus primarily on the work of Underhill because she does some wonderful teaching on prayer, particularly in a book that came out right at the beginning of World War I, so 1914, called Practical Mysticism. So there's that mysticism thing. Underhill, to the best of my knowledge, never claimed to be a mystic herself. She would have presented herself as somebody who teaches the wisdom of others from the past. That was kind of her sense of her own vocation. Now here I am 100 years later. I regularly refer to her as a mystic, so I guess that's the trouble. If you're going to teach the mystics, you'll get lumped in with them. So I don't know if that's good or bad. But in this book, Practical Mysticism, I love the subtitle. The subtitle is A Little Book for Normal People. So I don't know if I qualify or not. I'm not sure. What about those of us that are abnormal? But I think what she meant by that was to try to disabuse us of the notion that a serious spirituality only belongs to clergy, or only belongs to monks or nuns, or people who have a PhD, or various other kinds of abnormalities. That for those of us who spent most of our life, working at a bank, working in the local school, just living the life that we've been called to live, not necessarily a religious professional. That's what she means by normal people. What she does in this book is she kind of gives us a map. I was going to use the word taxonomy, that's kind of a college word, but this kind of map of spirituality. And she offers really 4 categories, but the 4th category she breaks up into 3 parts. So I'm going to throw these words out at you, and then one by one I'm going to try to kind of unpack them. She sees prayer as involving meditation, recollection, quiet, and then she offers what she calls 3 forms of contemplation. So meditation, recollection, quiet, and 3 forms of contemplation. So almost kind of like 6 dimensions of prayer. So I'm going to just kind of walk us through these 6 dimensions. And then we'll take some time for our own prayer. And hopefully there will be something in here that you can hang your hat on. Now, I want to preface this by saying what makes me nervous whenever I present something like this. Many of you are familiar with Catholic mysticism. There was a Spanish Carmelite nun called Teresa of Avila. She wrote a book called The Interior Castle. And she presents the spiritual life there as involving a trip through 7 mansions in this castle. The problem with something like that is you read this and you immediately start thinking, well, which mansion am I in? And many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with Jim Finley, who he teaches with the Living School. Wonderful, wonderful man. I've had a couple of wonderful conversations with him. He was a novice monk under Thomas Merton back in the day, probably back in the 1950s or so. And the story goes that when he went to the monastery, he was shy. He was really nervous. He tells this wonderful story about how Merton broke through his shell. He worked with the pig. He was the swineherd, basically. Merton would ask him about the pigs. Is that great? Thomas Merton, the great Thomas Merton, tell me how the pigs are doing. But apparently, Jim also, had been reading and wanted to impress his mentor. So he mentioned one day that he was reading The Interior Castle. He said, there are 7 mansions. I think I've made it to the 5th mansion. Well, Merton kind of knocked him down a peg or two. And Merton said, well, here in the monastery, nobody cares what mansion you're in. You probably haven't made it past the 2nd. So that was a moment of humility for poor Jim. He survived. So as we go through these, not 7 mansions, but these 6 kind of dimensions of prayer that Evelyn Underhill presents to us, try to avoid the temptation of seeing it as a hierarchy. Try to see it maybe more almost like a circle. And, maybe the earlier ones might be ones that are simpler. But there's also this idea that prayer, simplicity, can be its own virtue in prayer. I think that's what I'm trying to say. There was I think it was Catholic, but he may have been Anglican, Benedictine monk in the UK, in Britain, about 100 years ago, named John Chapman. Evelyn Underhill. I could be wrong, so don't quote me on this. It's on YouTube. I think he was a spiritual director of Evelyn Underhill for some time. I know they had some dealings. But he was famous for saying, pray as you can, not as you can. Wonderful line. Just reflect on that. Pray as you can, not as you can. So I think this is, when we talk about meditation, recollection, contemplation, centering prayer, all these different ways of praying, I think it's just important to acknowledge that there might be an exercise that maybe the person sitting next to you is practically having a vision of the Blessed Mother, and you're just sitting there kind of twitching. God made us all different. We all have our unique thumbprint, our unique DNA. And I think we all have a unique prayer profile. So it's really important to just let these different kinds of prayer kind of wash over you. And if there's a particular one that really seems to speak to you, you feel confident about it, or you feel drawn to it, maybe that's where you. If somebody else is scaling the 3rd form of contemplation, more power to them. You love God the way that you feel called to love God. So we'll start with meditation. And most of these quotes, I think, come from this book, Practical Mysticism, but some of them may come from some of her other books as well. Evelyn Underhill says, meditation is a halfway house between thinking and contemplation. And as a discipline, it derives its chief value from this transitional character. The real mystical life, which is the truly practical life, I love that, right? Begins at the beginning, not with supernatural acts and ecstatic apprehensions, but with the normal faculties of the normal human being. I do not require of you, says Teresa of Avila, I do not require of you, says Teresa to her pupils in meditation, I do not require of you to form great and curious considerations in your understanding. I require of you no more than to look. So what can we say about meditation? Well, first of all, I want to draw a distinction between kind of our cultural, our secular cultural understanding of meditation, which is basically cognate with the word mindfulness. I'm sure most of us here have encountered mindfulness. I am a big proponent of mindfulness. When my daughter died, my wife and I took a program on mindfulness stress reduction. It was, it'd be overeating the pudding to say it saved our lives, but it was a tremendous gift for us during our season. Mindfulness, I mean, Emory with their contemplative studies program, other, like Johns Hopkins, I think up in Boston, a number of universities are doing fairly robust research in how mindfulness practices, have real health benefits. So this idea of, kind of attentive silence, possibly working with a mantra, following your breath, that kind of thing, it's a good practice, whether in a secular context or in a more spiritual context. But we call it meditation, and what that does for those of us in the Christian contemplative tradition is it distorts the traditional Christian understanding of meditation. So I'm just drawing this distinction, again, not to knock the secular understanding, but to just try to help us to kind of wrap our mind around this. And so Underhill gives us this clue, and she says it's the halfway house between thinking and contemplation. So it is not a repudiation of thoughts. That's what's significant. It's not a repudiation of thoughts. I'm sure you all know the verse. You've probably heard preachers that begin their sermon with, "Let the words of my mouth and the meditations of my heart be acceptable to thy sight, O Lord, our strength and Redeemer." That, of course, comes from a Hebrew word that gets translated into English as meditation, but right away it gives you a sense. The words of my mouth, the meditation of my heart, there's a link there. So they both have content. The idea of a Christian sense of meditation is that we are reflecting on our faith. We're reflecting on our Lord, our God. We're reflecting on the truth of what we believe. We're reflecting on the virtues of the spiritual life. I was admiring the stained glass in the fellowship hall, which I know is the old nave, right? Once upon a time, that was the nave here. And it had the fruits of the Spirit and the gifts of the Spirit. It's really lovely. And and that is something you could meditate on. Does that make sense? Reflect on those gifts, those fruits. How are they at play in my life? How is the Holy Spirit calling me to joy, calling me to temperance, calling me to patience, especially when I'm on 285. So this is. And again, we're not used to thinking about this. It's prayer. That just sounds like I'm thinking about something. Again, Underhill says, well, it's the halfway house. It's more than just thinking about something. It's thinking about, reflecting on, I like the word reflecting on the truth and the gift of our faith with a light to making our hearts open and available for the Spirit's guidance. And in that sense, remember last week we talked about the definition of prayer, responding to God, responding to the love of God. In that sense, meditation is a way of responding to God. So Underhill invites us to recognize that we all have unruly, noisy, distracted minds and hearts. Reminded of the line, I think it's from one of the four quartets, where T.S. Eliot says we are distracted from distraction by distraction. The human condition. Right? So, but she quotes that lovely line from St. Teresa. All that is required is that you look. Remember last week we talked about this idea of beholding. should be whole, that you gaze. Gaze upon whatever it is that is the object of your meditation. It doesn't necessarily have to be word. You can meditate on an icon, meditate on a crucifix, meditate on nature. But the idea is that you are resting in this content with an eye to respond to the love of God. Then she takes us to a word that you don't hear a lot anymore. It's kind of fallen out of favor. But, let's give it a try and see if it'll work for us, and that's recollection. Now, being from the South, I remember, especially maybe a generation or two ahead of me, talking about, I recollect. I recollect when I was a young man, So what does that mean? When somebody says that, what do they say? I remember, I recall. Right? That's what we might say now, simpler, I recall. In my generation, maybe it's where recollection got involved, we just started recalling. But, so Underhill says, the human self, concentrated upon this image or idea, so again, building on meditation, dwelling on it more than thinking about it, as one may gaze upon a picture that one loves. Now, I'm going to editorialize a little, because gazing on a picture you love is great, but even better is gazing on a person. After almost 30 years of marriage, I still love eye contact with my wife. It makes me happy. It either makes her happy too, or she puts on a great show. She smiles. We just this afternoon, we kind of grabbed each other and gave each other a smooch, and just looked at each other and smiled. That's what I think Underhill is getting at. So in this you fall gradually and insensibly into the condition of reverie. And protected by this holy daydream from the more distracting dream of life, you sink into yourself and become, in the language of asceticism, the language of spirituality, recollected or gathered together. So what she's suggesting is the recollection is not necessarily a linear memory, like when Grandpa was talking about when he was a boy. That's a linear memory. Like I recollect when I was 10 years old. I mean, I'm to the point now where 10 years was a half a century ago. But this recollection is more of a vertical rather than a horizontal. I am recollecting the fact that I am creating the image of God. The fact that I have a home beyond the gift of this world. Not that there's anything wrong with this world. That's a subtle heresy. That the earth is bad and heaven is good. The earth is good and heaven is good. And I am invited to bring that. That's the recollection that Underhill is suggesting. We ponder. We pardon the pun, it is God. So it's getting a little bit more towards the silence. Okay? So we begin with just normal, ordinary thinking. With meditation, our thinking begins to have maybe a little bit of space in it. We're really creating a space in our heart for the presence of God, that the acknowledged presence. God is there whenever we create space for God. The acknowledged presence. With recollection, it's like we're moving a little bit more into the silence. So we're trying to find stillness. That's what the recollection is. Trying to find stillness. Think about if you have a pendulum or those things that you sometimes see on people's desks with a 5-ball, I've never understood the purpose. So I guess it's just a little worry device or whatever. But eventually, gravity takes its toll, right? And the balls slow down. Or if you have a pendulum, eventually it stops swinging. I remember when I was 8 or 9 years old, and my mom and dad took me to Washington, D.C., and we walked into the Smithsonian, and a huge pendulum was there. I was like, fascinating. I love digressions, never met one. So recollection is the slowing of the mind. It's the giving ourselves that space, and we just allow stillness to be more present. So here Underhill is suggesting a little bit more discipline. Meditation maybe is more free range. With recollection, we're trying to be a bit more intentional about finding that still point, finding the silence between our words. So with recollection, we take our first steps into silence. Not repudiating the cognitive gifts, the thoughts, the reflections, the meditations, the principles of our spirituality. But acknowledging, like, just between every heartbeat, there's a moment of silence. The average human being, if you live 70 or 80 years with average health, you're going to have 3 billion heartbeats. Isn't that mind-boggling? Which means you're going to have 3 billion moments of rest and silence between every heartbeat. That's something to meditate. So we begin to notice the silence. And then that takes us to Underhill's third dimension of prayer, which she simply calls quiet. Again, she's building off of that Teresa of Avila. Teresa of Avila uses this phrase, the prayer of quiet. Prayer of quiet. So here's a quote from Underhill. In recollection, the surface mind still holds, so to speak. So it's kind of like your ego is still more or less in the driver's seat. But in quiet, it surrenders more wholly, allowing our consciousness to sink into that blissful silence in which God works and speaks. This act of surrender, this deliberate negation of thought, is an essential preliminary of the contemplative state. Now, remember last week I introduced you to the 4 kind of steps, to the 4 guidelines to centering prayer. If you ever have the chance to watch a video with Father Thomas Keating or read one of his books, he will tell you centering prayer is not contemplation. He will say centering prayer prepares us for contemplation. So I think that the centering prayer practice really does correspond with Evelyn Underhill's prayer of quiet. That what you're doing when you move into a practice like this, and centering prayer is not the only example. I teach that because I've been trained to teach that. But there's also another one that's very well, 2 others. From the Eastern Orthodox tradition, the Jesus prayer. The idea of reciting a simple verse like, Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy on me. And then a ministry called the World Committee for Christian Meditation, or the World Council for Christian, the World Community for Christian Meditation, WCCM. You go online, wccm.org. It's founded by a Benedictine monk named John May, who lived in India and studied Eastern forms of meditation, and then went back to his monastery and, with the support of his fellow monks, adapted that to a more Christian practice. So yeah, that practice is very, very specifically Eastern. He talks about using a word like Maranatha as a mantra. So it is a mantra meditation, but Christian. So there's these different techniques. They all really point to the same goal, and that is to move into a place where the silence itself becomes our prayer. There's a verse in Psalm 65, but you have to have the right English translation, because it's one of those verses in the original Hebrew is kind of ambiguous. Different translations will render it different ways. I think the New Revised Standard, which is that's the lectionary here, is the New Revised Standard, right? The New Revised Standard is, translates that verse as like, praise is due to you, O God. Praise, by praising God, is due to you. Well, that makes theological sense. God is worthy of all praise. But this verse can also be translated, I would argue, more accurately translated. Silence is praise to you, O God. Silence is praise. Because that word that gets translated as due actually carries a connotation of a silence. It's like a waiting silence or a pregnant pause. Silence is praise. Wow, to see silence in a relational way. That silence actually becomes the content of our relationship with God. Really important. Thomas Keating, quoting Rumi, but kind of putting his own spin on it, says silence is God's first language. Everything else is but a poor translation. But a poor translation. Silence is God's first language. Everything else but a poor translation. So now we're going to go into Underhill's 3 forms of what she calls contemplation. She says the first form of contemplation. She says you are to push back the self's barriers bit by bit until at last all duration is included in the widening circles of its intuitive love. Until you find in every manifestation of life, even those which you have petulantly classified as cruel or obscene, the ardent self-expression of that immanent being whose spark burns deep in your own soul. If on the surface that feels like it flew right over your head, just bear with me, because she's giving us some fairly elevated mystical theology. What she is basically saying is that we are invited, I'll use a word that I'm sure most of you have probably bumped into. We are being invited into non-duality. Non-duality. And that is really a loan word from Eastern spirituality. The best analogy I can think of for non-duality is imagine you're standing at the North Pole. You're standing at the North Pole. Every direction is south. Right? Every direction is south. If you are standing in the heart of God, every direction is something to love. Does that make sense? So people will ask me, how can you teach non-duality? There's evil in the world, Ukraine, abuse, children getting hurt. I'm like, absolutely, and as Christians we are called to fight all of that. We are called to build the kingdom. Then how can you talk about non-duality? Like, are you doing the work you were called to do out of a place of unconditional love? That's the question. The non-duality is not about what's out there, my friends. The non-duality is about what's in. When we are called into the heart of God, everything is an object for love. We may express that love in different ways. When my wife's first husband became abusive, she expressed love to him by leaving. Does that make sense? I don't think she would mind me telling you that. She said, sometimes you express love by hanging in there and trying to help the person to go into recovery or whatever, but sometimes you have to express love by giving. By saying to the person, I'm going to take away from you the thing that you're hurting, because you hurting me hurts you. So, but that's what non-duality is to find in everything we do the love of God. And we are being called into that consciousness. That's the first form of contemplation. That's entry level. The Jesuits and their spiritual tradition, again, in the Catholic world, but it's for everybody. It's called Ignatian spirituality after its followers, St. Ignatius of Loyola. If any of you have ever been to Ignatius' house over on Riverside Drive, that's, the Jesuits are behind. St. Ignatius, one of his catchlines was, find God in all things. Find God in all things. He didn't invent it. St. Benedict, the founder of the Benedictine monastic order, he wrote very explicitly in the Rule of St. Benedict, he said, we believe the divine presence is everywhere. Julian of Norwich, who we met last week, said the fullness of joy is to behold God. So this is a theme that just keeps showing up again and again in our tradition. Think about the psalm, if I make my bed in heaven, you are there. Or if I fly to heaven, you are there. If I make my bed in the underworld, you are there. So what Underhill is suggesting is that, and again, she's following really kind of classical spiritual theology here. Meditation, recollection, and quiet. We can be in the driver's seat for those. But when we start moving into the forms of contemplation, we're moving into prayer where God has to be in the driver's seat. So our job is, it's less about what we achieve and more about what we receive. Now, let me editorialize again. That doesn't mean that if you are having this amazing non-dual experience and tears are running down your face because you're just cascading with the love of God, the person sitting next to you is like, well, am I just chopped liver? Yeah. No, that's not how it works. What we're all called to do is to trust the divine presence, that God works in each of our hearts in the manner appropriate and necessary for us. Which means some people have amazing experiences and others don't. I have a friend who's a monk. He's lived out in the monastery on the corners for 50 or 60 years, and he'll tell you, he says, I've never had a mystical experience. And I say, well, why did you stay? And he says, because I love the Lord. And I'm like, he doesn't. Julian of Norwich said that. She said, I had visions. That doesn't make me better than anyone else. She said, the visions were given in order that we may love God more. And she said, and if you love God more than I do, they're more for you than they are for me. That's good, solid spiritual theology. Miracles, mystical experiences, supernatural, whatever. All of that kind of psychic window dressing is not the point. The point is divine love. Divine love is available to each and every one of us. We are created in the image and likeness of God, which means it's already been created. Why do we pray? We pray to set it free. So what I do believe, this is what Underhill says, is that the forms of contemplation are the fruit of a maturing life of prayer. So whether you are 16 years old or 96 years old or whatever, the way to grow closer to God is to focus on the forms of prayer that you are, number one, called to, and number two, are within your purview. So focus on meditation, focus on recollection, focus on silent forms of prayer, the prayers of quiet. And these other graced moments you may find coming to you, bidden or unbidden. The second form of contemplation, she writes, you will observe that you have entered into an intense and vivid silence, a silence which exists in itself, through and in spite of the ceaseless noises of your normal world. Within this world of silence, you seem, as it were, to lose yourself, to ebb and to flow, to wander and be lost in the imageless ground, says the great mystic John Roysbrook. She says this is the self's first initiation into the wayless world beyond image, where all is yet in no wise. What is she saying here? She's saying there's the silence that we can find in our heart, in between our thoughts. And sometimes we are ushered into a silence that seems just so very much deep. I don't know if I've ever experienced that or not, but I know that I have experienced moments in prayer where the silence just seemed to be all pervasive. Maybe that was the grace of contemplation. Maybe I finally got the monkey to take it. I don't know. but that's kind of what I think it would be like. It would be like this erased moment where the silence just seems to flow. And then on to the third form of contemplation. Underhill describes this as an attitude of perfect generosity, complete submission. Again, she's using traditional language, writing over 100 years ago. Willing acquiescence in anything that may happen, even in failure and death, is here your only hope. For union with reality can only be a union of love, a glad and humble self-emergence in universal life. You must, so far as you are able, give yourself up to, die into, melt into the whole, abandon all efforts to lay hold of it. So whenever I read that passage, I'm just reminded, for me to live as Christ and to die as gain. There's this language in the New Testament, and we tend to be a little squeamish about it, but there's this death language. It's good for Lent. And, and I think we misunderstand it. St. Paul is not telling us to make a fetish out of death. That's not the point here. My wife has a friend who is not a Christian, and she was criticizing Christianity to a friend a little while back, and she said, "It seems like you guys, all you have are these symbols of this dead person." It's like it's a death cult. And I said, we talked about it, I said, it's such a misunderstanding, and she isn't the first person to have said this. I said, it's such a misunderstanding that the cross represents the triumph over death. It's not that death here is love for us. It's that we're not constrained by that. It's a significant distinction we often miss. But this idea we're called to die. Well, the reality is guess what? Every one of us is called to die. I am happy to delay it for another 20 or 30 years. It's at the bottom of trying to do this. But the day will come. And, we could be 110 years old. I don't know anybody who's lived that long, but I do know people who've lived in their hundreds. One of the monks, he was 102 when he died, and when he died, it gutted. And I realized, I don't care how old you are, when it comes, it's too soon. When it comes, it's too soon. It's just the reality. Especially for those of us left here. Probably for Father Luke, he was kind of like, I'm ready, but for those of us who we were gutted. So there's a pain, there's a sting. St. Paul says, death, where is thy sting? Well, it's still there. We just knew it's not the Bible. But contemplative prayer, there was a writer, she passed away a couple of years ago, named Kathleen Singh, S-I-N-G-H, and she wrote a book called The Grace in Dying. If you're interested in the spirituality of death, it is the best book on the spirituality of death that I have read. I've read it for years. She was a hospice nurse, I think, a psychologist, and she knows her way around psychology. And I don't know that she was identified as Christian, but she certainly knew Christian theology. Her book is kind of interspiritual in its focus. But she basically makes the case that contemplative ways of meditating or praying are the best thing we can do to prepare for our own death. Because the dying process is essentially like the contemplative process. It's this radical letting go into the love and heart of God. That's all it is. So if you would hope and pray that you have a good death, I would encourage you to take up a sacred prayer or something. It will prepare you. It will prepare you. So this is this idea that again, what are we called to? We're called to, we were created in the image and likeness of God. We are called to live that image and likeness. We are called to be Christ. That's what the word Christian means. We are little Christs. There's a billion little Christs running around. The planet is infested with us. But we have work to do, don't we? So today, Ukraine, we have work to do. We've all been given it by virtue of our baptism. Turn to page 303 in the book of Contemplation. Read the agreement. If you haven't read that one, if you don't ever read any other user agreement in your life, read that one. And we had our work to do. But that's what the third form of contemplation is. It's praying ourselves into the God, even if it feels like God. Even if it feels like God. So, I'm conscious of time. Any questions or comments or thoughts about any of this?
When you're talking about dying, in this process that you shared with us, I mean, the way I sort of interpret it is you're letting go of the ego quite a bit. And it's liberating because you stop being so concerned with the minutia and you're more able to be present to what's important. And my language is limited, but I just wondered if you had any sort of, is this similar to what you're talking about?
When I'm listening to you, I'm reminded of the book that was a bestseller, 10 or 20 years ago, called Don't Sweat the Small Stuff, and it's all small stuff. That, I think there is this reality that no matter how deep we go into the spiritual life, we'll still get annoyed by traffic. Our kids will trigger us. It will still happen. You get a letter from the IRS and you're immediately in panic mode. It still happens. But the reality is that that's not the whole story. It's kind of like there's a deepening. There's a wonderful story. It's not a Buddhist tradition, but I think it's just as appropriate in the Christian world. A wonderful writer. She's a Buddhist nun named Emma Chodron. Some of you may have read her book. Her books are wonderful. And I heard an interview with her a couple of years ago. This younger woman was interviewing her, and she said, the interviewer said, so have you been enlightened? And Pema said, oh heavens no, what a silly question. And then the interviewer said, but you've been a Buddhist nun now for 50 years. She was in her 70s. She said, what do you have to show for it? Oh. That's a great question. But here's the question for all of us. If Christianity were illegal, would they have enough evidence to convince? Question is one. So Emma is silent for a minute, and they left it in, so there's this dead air on the CD. And then she says, well, when I get angry now, I get over it more quickly. I thought, she's got it. She's got it. I get angry now, I get over it more quickly. So I think that's kind of what we're still going to get angry. We're still going to get triggered. Well, I think Evelyn Underhill is, because especially when you get to that third form, I made no claim to it. But I think what Kathleen Singh is telling us is we will all go there, even if it's just at the moment of our physical. We will all go there. So, So it's just this idea to be in that place of, you mentioned egoic release, of radical egoic release, 100% trust in the heart of God. The fundamental question, is the universe a safe place? Christianity is one big yes to that question. Despite all the sin, despite all the injustice, all the oppression, systems of racism, sexism, systems of privilege, all the war, the stupidity in Ukraine, all of that which we are continually called to struggle against. We struggle against it because we believe the universe is a safe place. And a prayer is response to the love of God. Prayer is my desire to live in alignment with that state, that existential divine state. So maybe this is a good time to take a few minutes and be silent together. Can we do that? If you weren't here last week, very, very briefly, the invitation is to pick a sacred word or a Bible verse, something short and sweet, to symbolize your intention to consent to the love of God. And as we move into the silence, I'm going to set a timer for like just 5 minutes, not too long, maybe 10, we'll do 10. Stretch it. We will, just, your mind will wander. I'm not saying if your mind wanders, when your mind wanders. Your mind will wander. You'll start thinking about whatever it was you watched on Netflix last night. For me, it was Star Trek. Whatever it might have been, your mind will go there, and then you just return to your sacred word. You just do it as often as necessary. And if by grace you're brought into that silence, rest in the silence. And then your mind will say, isn't this cool? I'm resting in the silence. And then you just reintroduce this. The way my timer is set up, it's a chime, and then actually it's like a gong. It's like a gong, and then there'll be 5 minutes, and then a chime. It's halfway point, and the third chime will finish up. Okay? You get it set up, and then we God, your goodness, give us yourself. You are enough for us. We can ask for nothing less that is fully to your worship. If we were to ask for anything else, we would be left in want. It is only in you that we have all. But before we, got off 20 minutes, before we hang out with Archbishop Rowan for a few minutes, just to see if there are any thoughts or reflections on the silence or any lingering from Evelyn Underhill. I gave Evelyn Underhill the lion's share of the attention tonight, but on your handout, you have a page devoted to her, a page devoted to Rowan. We'll probably only get to one or two of the quotes from Rowan, and you can certainly take the rest from her. Questions or comments? Yes, in the back.
I know a family that was told by a hospice nurse, first of all, that, you know, a person that's dying is very quiet and might look like they're in a coma, but they're very quiet and breathing and all that, but they might be hearing. Anyway, the hospice nurse said they might be traveling from one place to another, or they might be quiet, but if you say, "We love you," that brings them right back. You know, and they're out of what they were in, you know, and so like gentle touching or something like that.
I know when my mother-in-law was passing away, my wife was very good about that. She had said to me, I guess just from her travels and talking to hospice nurses or whatever, she said, she knows. So she would just take her hand and hold it and just speak very soothingly to her. It was really beautiful to watch. And so I think there's a lot of truth. Anything else? what I'd like to do is to tell you what really there's a lot to admire about Rowan Williams, but kind of my favorite little bit about him is that towards the end of his tenure as the Archbishop of Canterbury, then Pope Benedict XVI invited him to come and address the Synod of Catholic Bishops in Rome. This is in 2012, October of 2012. It was almost 10 years ago now. It was the first time that an Anglican Archbishop of Canterbury, an Anglican primate, had been invited into Rome to speak to the Catholic bishops. So it was a significant ecumenical moment, a moment of some historical gravitas. And what just makes my heart sing is that Archbishop Williams chose to speak on contemplation. That he could have spoken on almost anything, at this historical moment. And he spoke on the need for the church to proclaim and practice its own contemplative dimension. You can find a YouTube video, it's about a 20-minute, almost like a TED Talk, about a 20-minute address that he gave to the bishops. And if you go to his own website, the transcript of the talk is on his website, and it is really worth reading or watching the entire thing. But the first paragraph on the Rowan Williams page is from that address. So let me read this to you. And then I'm going to just share some thoughts that I have in response, and then I just would like to open it up for conversation. So again, his topic is contemplation. Contemplation is very far from being just one kind of thing that Christians do. It is the key to prayer, liturgy, art, and ethics. The key to the essence of a renewed humanity that is capable of seeing the world and other subjects in the world with freedom. Freedom from self-oriented, acquisitive habits and the distorted understanding that comes from them. To put it boldly, contemplation is the only ultimate answer to the unreal and insane world that our financial systems and our advertising culture and our chaotic and unexamined emotions encourage us to inhabit. To learn contemplative practice is to learn what we need so as to live truthfully and honestly and lovingly. It is a deeply revolutionary matter. I think this bears repeating so that we can read it. Contemplation is very far from being just one kind of thing that Christians do. It is the key to prayer, liturgy, art, and ethics. The key to the essence of a renewed humanity capable of seeing the world and other subjects in the world with freedom. Freedom from self-oriented, acquisitive habits and the distorted understanding that comes from them. To put it boldly, contemplation is the only ultimate answer to the unreal and insane world that our financial systems and our advertising culture and our chaotic and unexamined emotions encourage us to inhabit. To learn contemplative practice is to learn what we need so as to live truthfully and honestly and lovingly. It is a deeply revolutionary matter. Sorry?
I think it's worse now.
Yeah, well, he didn't even have Ukraine to talk about, or the political climate, how it's heated up. not only here in the United States, but in other parts of the world as well. So you're right, I think that the forces that he is suggesting contemplation can mitigate against, if anything, those forces seem to have gotten worse in the last 10 years. So, as I read this, I love entertainment as much as the next person. I've got a Paramount Plus subscription and a Netflix subscription, and I hop on and off of Disney Plus depending on what they got going. It's all good. And yet, think about like the Marvel movies or some of that stuff. Some of you may not subject yourself to that, but a Marvel movie, it's comic books and movie form. So you got the super Spider-Man and Iron Man and all these guys, and they're fighting the big mean baddies from outer space. They're like an emotional whiplash watching these things, because it's always, the world is about to come to an end, and of course it's aimed at 16-year-old boys. So there's lots of explosions, lots and lots of explosions, lots of, one of the movies, the entire island of Manhattan just gets, gets chaos, just goes blowing windows out. Yeah, it's amazing what you can do with a computer. But, so when he talks about our chaotic and unexamined emotions, I think, yeah, they are unexamined in the sense that we aren't paying attention to them. But boy, there are people out there making money off of us. Yeah. Again, I'm not saying that anything wrong with a good entertaining movie, anything wrong with a good old-fashioned, the white hats and the black hats and the good guys win in the end, blah, 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 blah. I'm all for that. But I'm also all for, on a deeper level, I'm all for maybe examining those chaotic emotions and asking, is there another way? Is there another way? And so he says, our self-oriented, acquisitive habits. Okay, this is going to make us all hurt a little. Has anybody seen the little video? It's online. And again, it came out maybe 15 or 20 years ago. It's called The Story of Stuff. Have you seen that? Google that when you get home. The Story of Stuff. But be prepared to use some good old-fashioned Southern Baptist language. You will be convicted when you watch this. I know I am. I think it looks like we're all pretty much the same socioeconomic class here. Do you know the average consumer good from the resources being harvested, whether mined or harvested or whatever, to the landfill is 6 months? The average consumer good. Do you know that when you donate clothes to an organization like Goodwill or something, they will sell, and I'm just pulling these numbers out of the top of my head, but you can do the research. They will sell in their stores maybe 10%. Hey, I am Goodwill chic there. That's you can buy some bargains there. They'll sell maybe 10%. Another 20 to 30% might get shipped over to Africa. And the rest will end up in the land. The rest will end up in the land. I'm not saying don't support Goodwill. Goodwill does good work, but that's the reality of the world we live in. Think of all the cars. So many of us, we buy a new car every 2 to 3 years. So. Yeah, not everybody. I'm driving a 2009 Subaru, and that Subaru probably survived me.
I'm driving a 2000 Accord.
Okay, you have a Honda or that?
Oh, man.
But I'll tell you, I have a brother, and I love him dearly. He gets a new car every year or two. I mean, we're talking, he's going, well, we're talking BMWs, nice cars. And of course he trades in the other ones, so somebody gets to buy that car. But eventually, that car's going to end up being crunched up into the nut.
Yes, I noticed as a characteristic of modern life, storage universe.
Absolutely. Yeah, when we were kids, they didn't exist, did they? And now they're air conditioned with climate control and not only that people are living in them, which says a lot about our culture. So, friends, I'm preaching to myself as I preach. My purpose is not to shame any of us. My purpose is to acknowledge that this is the world we have created. We together have created. The world of self-oriented, inquisitive habits. And the problem with it is not only is our environment taking the brunt, but the problem is that it's not distributed. That you go to Manila, go to Calcutta, go to so many cities in the world, or even some neighborhoods here in Atlanta, and you will see the inequity of this. So all of that is at play. So he says contemplation isn't just one thing we do. Like you can compartmentalize it. Well, I'm into Bible study. Yeah, I'm into Habitat for Humanity. What are you into? Well, I do centering prayer. Like it's a flavor. Like you go into Baskin Robbins, you know, and I'll have my Eucharist on the side of science. It's saying no. It's saying this is the foundation. This is the heart of all that we do. So yes, do your Bible study, do you know, whatever it is you do, whether it's fun or whether it's building the kingdom or, you know, I mean, you know, this thing about churches generally do good things. I mean, sometimes they get off the rails, but generally do good things. But my point is, whatever it is, underneath it, you need to, back to what we looked at last week, you need this fundamental gesture of response to all of it has to emerge out of that. And then, and then the unreal and insane world that our financial systems and our advertising culture. And see, and I would add to that, and our entertainment culture. Again, like I said, I love Netflix, but you know, the banks, the marketing folks, and the Hollywood folks. You know. And hey, I don't know about you guys, but the film crews are in our neighborhood all the time. You know, I mean, it's kind of exciting. I mean, we watched a movie a couple of years ago, and North Decatur Presbyterian was in the movie. And, you know, and it's like, there's this church, and I'm like, I know that church. But the point is that we have calibrated our culture. Go to a European city and look at 500 years ago. The biggest building anywhere was the cathedral. Right? Then maybe, I don't know, 100 years ago, or I don't know how long ago, the biggest buildings would be the courthouses. Today, the biggest buildings are the stadiums, or the shopping malls, entertainment, consumers. Again, not to shame us, but what Rowan Williams is saying is, if this bugs you, and I think if I see a lot of nodding heads, if this bugs you, then the solution, well, we can talk about, you know, yeah, how do we preserve the church, how do we pass on the faith, how do we get our kids to come on Sunday morning, for heaven's sake? Well, maybe the solution, before we even ask all of those questions, is meditation, recollection, prayer and quiet, opening our hearts up. And this, I'll tell you, as Americans, I don't know about you, but that drives me nuts. If I was sitting out there right now listening to somebody say that to me, I would be twitching. Because I was taught that America is a can-do country and that our job is to make things happen. So, in other words, my prayer should be, Heavenly Father, thank you, I've got it under control. How are we doing? Oh, we got 3 minutes. And I'm sorry, I was hoping this would be a conversation, but it turned into a rant. So I apologize for that. But my hope is that, you know, you will step away from my chaotic and unexamined mood emotions. And in the silence of your own hearts, maybe just reflect on this. That what, again, remember how we began tonight. I chose these two figures because they are teachers. Why can't we learn? I'll leave it at that. We have 3 minutes, so if anybody has anything they're burning to say.
So I'm just say that right away. So this is absolutely crucial. I mean,
We're talking about our environment, our biosphere, exactly.
And the church has not emphasized contemplation as a practice of faith. And I'm just, and it makes me a little crazy. I mean, I get some of it, but how did we get so far?
Oh boy, in 3 minutes. I did an interview. There's an organization based here in Atlanta called the Center for Progressive Renewal. It's a think tank with the United Church of Christ. And they just interviewed me. They're doing a conference later this year on the future of spirituality. And so I was one of the people I wanted to talk to. So, and they asked me, they said, what do you think is the future of spirituality? And I quoted Karl Rahner, who said, the Christian of the future will be a mystic or will not exist. But then, I had to unpack that. But I agree with you. And the difference between you and me and our 20-year-old friends or children or grandchildren is that we still come. That we still come. And every church, I mean, and look at us, every church, some 20-year-old walks into a church and they're all like, well, hello. Don't be shy. Do you have any children that need to be baptized? But the reason why the kids are voting with their feet is because the kids, what are the kids worried about? They're worried about violence against transgender people. They're worried about the environment. They're worried about Ukraine. All those kinds of things. And they come to church. I don't know about Holy Trinity. Holy Trinity, from what I can tell, seems to be a beautiful, healthy, loving community. I'm speaking in general. They come to church, and what do they hear? They hear pledge campaigns and how do we get young people in the pews. It's like we aren't tracking with where the heart of our children are. And I think it's because we don't know how to. I think that's the key. We don't know how to listen. Christianity is a talking religion. Again, I don't mean to pick on the 2 guys back there because we pay them to talk. They pay me to talk, and I don't even get to wear the call. But the reality is that maybe in addition to all the talking, that we are asked to do, maybe we all need to do a little bit more listening. And so somebody said in the class I was teaching last night, they said, this was in a Catholic context, and they said, I'm most comfortable with Catholics on the margins. And I go, well, that's true for me too. And because who've been on the margins? Well, the people agitating for change, the people agitating for social justice, the mystics, the misfits, those kinds of folks. It's like, man, that seems to be where the Holy Spirit is working. Well, maybe we need to learn to listen to people on our margins, wherever we might be. I know it's time for conflict. So, do I turn it over to one of you gentlemen, or do we have somebody else who's going to lead? Next week, we're going to get a little bit more creative. We're going to look at a great poet and a great poet/novelist and talk about creativity.